Greetings. We are still in late July in 30 AD. We are Ab the 7th, Wednesday, July 26th. The subtext is Jesus at Jacob's well near Sychar, Dinah, the Samaritan woman. I'm going to call her Dinah, I guess. On the following day, Jesus crossed the little river and, leaving Mount Gerizim to the right, approached Shechem. Andrew, James the Greater, and Saturnin accompanied him, the others having scattered in different directions. Jesus went to the well of Jacob on a little hill in the inheritance of Joseph to the north of Mount Gerizim and south of Mount Ebal. Shechem lay about a quarter of an hour to the west in the valley, which ran along the west side of the city for about an hour. About 2 good hours northward from Sychar stood the city of Samaria upon a mountain. Several deeply rutted roads ran from different points around the little hill and up to the octangular buildings that enclosed Jacob's well, which was surrounded by trees and grassy seats. The spring house was encircled by an open arched gallery under which about 20 people could find standing room. Directly opposite the road that led to Shechem and under the arched roof was the door, usually kept shut, that opened into the spring house proper. There was an aperture in the cover of the latter, which could be closed at pleasure. The interior of the little spring house was quite roomy. The well was deep and surrounded by a stone rim high enough to afford a seat. Between it and the walls, one could walk around freely. The well had a wooden cover, which, when open, disclosed a large cylinder just opposite the entrance and lying across the well. On it hung the bucket, which was unwound by means of a winch. Opposite the door was a pump for raising the water to the top of the wall of the spring house, whence it flowed out to the east, south, and west under the surrounding arches into 3 little basins dug in the earth. They were intended for travelers to perform their ablutions and wash their feet, also for watering beasts of burden. It was toward midday, and I'll note this in the notes later, when Jesus and the 3 disciples reached the hill. Jesus sent them on to Shechem to procure food, for he was hungry, while he himself ascended the hill alone to await them. The day was hot, and Jesus was very tired and thirsty. He sat down a short distance from the well on the side of the path that led up from Shechem. Resting his head upon his hand, he seemed to be patiently waiting for someone to open the well and give him it to drink. And now I saw a Samaritan woman of about 30 years, a leathern bottle hanging from her arm, coming up the hill from Shechem to draw water. She was beautiful, and I remarked how briskly and vigorously and with what long strides she mounted the hill. Her costume appeared somewhat studied, and there was an air of distinction about it. Her dress was striped blue and red, embroidered with large yellow flowers. The sleeves above and below the elbow were fastened by yellow bracelets and were ruffled at the wrist. She wore a white stomacher ornamented with yellow cords. Her neck was entirely concealed by a yellow woolen collar thickly covered with strings of pearl and coral. Her veil, very fine and long, was woven of some rich woolen material. It hung down her back, but by means of a string that could be drawn together and fastened around her waist. When thus worn, it formed a point behind and on either side folds in which the elbows could comfortably rest. When both sides of the veil were fastened on the breast, the whole of the upper part of her person was enveloped as if in a mantle. Her head was bound with fillets that entirely concealed her hair. From her headdress there arose above the forehead something like a little tower or a crown. Tucked up behind it lay the forepart of the veil which, when let down over her face, reached to the breast. She had her large brownish goat or camel hair apron, with its open pockets, thrown up over her right arm, so that the leather bottle hanging on that arm was partially concealed. This apron was similar to those usually worn at such work as drawing water. It protected the dress from the bucket and the water bottle. The bottle was of leather and like a seamless sack. It was convex at two sides as if lined with a firm arched wooden surface, but the two others, when the bottle was empty, lay together in folds like those of a pocketbook. On the two firm sides were leather cover handles through which ran a leather strap used for carrying on the arm. The mouth of the bottle was narrow. It could be opened like a funnel for receiving the contents and closed again like a work pouch. When empty, the bottle hung flat on the side, but when filled, it bulged out, holding as much as an ordinary water bucket. It was under this guise that I saw the woman briskly ascending the hill to get water from Jacob's well for herself and for others. I took a fancy to her right away. She was so kind, so frank, so open-hearted. She was called Dinah, was the child of a mixed marriage, and belonged to the sect of Samaritans. She lived in Shechem, but it was not her birthplace. Her peculiar circumstances were unknown to the inhabitants, among whom she went by the name of Salome. Both she and her husband were very much liked on account of their open, friendly, and obliging manners. The windings of the path by which she mounted the hill prevented Dinah's seeing the Lord until she actually stood before him. There was something startling in the sight as he sat there exhausted and all alone on the path leading to Jacob's well. He wore a long white robe of fine wool like an alb, bound with a broad girdle. It was a garment such as the prophets wore, and which the disciples usually carried for him. He made use of it only on solemn occasions when he preached or fulfilled some prophecy. Dinah, coming thus suddenly upon Jesus, was startled. She lowered her veil and hesitated to advance, for the Lord was sitting full in her path. I saw passing through her mind the characteristic thoughts. A man! What is he doing here? Is it a temptation? She saw that Jesus was a Jew as, beaming with benevolence, he graciously drew his feet back, for the path was narrow, with the words, "Pass on, and give me to drink." These words touched the woman, since the Jews and the Samaritans were accustomed to exchange only glances of mutual aversion. And so she still lingered, saying, "Why art thou here all alone at this hour? If anyone should happen to see me here with thee, he would be scandalized." To which Jesus answered that his companions had gone on to the city to purchase food. Dinah said, "Indeed, the 3 men whom I met, but they will find little at this hour. What the Shechemites have prepared for today they need for themselves." She spoke as if it were either a feast or a fast that day in Sychar, and named another place to which they should have gone for food. But Jesus again said, "Pass on, and give me to drink." Then Dinah passed by him. Jesus arose and followed her to the well, which she unlocked. While going thither, she said, "How canst thou, being a Jew, ask a drink from a Samaritan?" Jesus answered her, "If thou didst know the gift of God, and who he is that saith to thee, 'Give me to drink,' thou wouldst perhaps have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water." Then Dinah loosened the cover and the bucket, meanwhile saying to Jesus, who had seated himself on the rim of the well, "Sir, thou hast nothing wherein to draw, and the well is deep. Whence then hast thou living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle?" As she uttered these words, I had a vision of Jacob's digging the well and the water springing up. The woman understood Jesus' words to refer to the water of this well, and so as she was speaking, she put the bucket on the cylinder, which turned heavily, lowered it, and drew it up again. She pushed up her sleeves with the bracelets until they puffed out high above the elbow, and in this way, with bare arms, she filled her leather bottle out of the bucket. Then taking a little vessel made of bark and shaped like a horn, she filled it with water and handed it to Jesus, who, sitting on the rim of the well, drank it and said to her, "Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But he that shall drink of the water that I shall give him shall not thirst forever. Yes, the water that I will give him shall become in him a fountain of water springing into life everlasting." Dinah replied eagerly, "Sir, give me that living water, that I may no more thirst, nor have to come with so much fatigue to draw." She was struck by his words, living water, and had a presentiment, though without being fully conscious of it, that Jesus meant only by the living water the fulfillment of the promise. And so it was under prophetic inspiration that she uttered her heartfelt prayer for that living water. I've always felt and understood that those persons with whom the Redeemer treated are not to be considered as mere individuals. They perfectly represented a whole race of people, and they did so because they belonged to the plenitude of time. So when Dinah the Samaritan there stood before the Redeemer, the whole Samaritan sect, so long separated from the true faith of Israel, from the fountain of living water. Jesus at the well of Jacob thirsted after the chosen souls of Samaria, in order to refresh them with the living waters from which they had cut themselves off from. It was that portion of the rebellious sect still open to salvation that here thirsted after this living water and, in a certain way, reached out an open hand to receive it. Samaria spoke through Dinah, "Give me, O Lord, the blessing of the promise. Help me to obtain the living water from which I may receive more consolation than from this temporal well of Jacob, through which alone we still have communication with the Jews." When Dinah had thus spoken, Jesus said to her, "Go home, call thy husband, and come back hither." And I heard him give the command twice, because it was not to instruct her alone that he had come. In this command the Redeemer addressed the whole sect. "Samaria, call hither him to whom thou belongest, him who by a holy contract is lawfully bound to thee." Dinah replied to the Lord, "I have no husband." Samaria confessed to the bridegroom of souls that she had no contract, that she belonged to no one. Jesus replied, "Thou hast said well, for thou hast had 5 husbands, and he with whom thou now livest is not thy husband. Thou hast spoken truly." In these words, the Messiah said to the sect, Samaria, thou speakest the truth. Thou hast been espoused to the idols of 5 different nations, and thy present alliance with God is no marriage contract. Here, Dinah, lowering her eyes and hanging her head, answered, Sir, I see that thou art a prophet. And she drew down her veil. The Samaritan sect recognized the divine mission of the Lord and confessed its own guilt. As if Dinah understood the prophetic meaning of Jesus' words, and he with whom thou livest is not thy husband, that is, thy actual connection with the true God is imperfect and illegal. The religion of the Samaritans has, by sin and self-will, been separated from God's covenant with Jacob. As if she felt the deep significance of these words, she pointed toward the south, to the temple not far off on Mount Gerizim, and said questioningly, Our fathers adored on that mountain, and you say that Jerusalem is the place where men must adore. Jesus replied with the words, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when neither in Gerizim nor in Jerusalem wilt thou adore the Father. In this reply he meant to say, Samaria, the hour cometh when neither here nor in the sanctuary of the temple will God be adored, because he walks in the midst of you. And he continued, You adore that which you do not know, but we adore that which we do know, for salvation is of the Jews. Here, he related to her a similitude of the wild, unfruitful suckers of trees, which shoot forth into wood and foliage, but produce no fruit. It was as if he had said to the sect, Samaria, thou hast not security in thy worship, thou hast no union, no sacrament, no pledge of allegiance, no ark of the covenant, no fruit. The Jews, from whom the Messiah will be born, have all these things, the promise and its fulfillment. And again Jesus said, But the hour cometh, and now is when the true adorers will adore the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father wills such to adore him. God is a spirit, and they that adore him must adore him in spirit and in truth. By these words the Redeemer meant, Samaria, the hour cometh, it now is, when the Father by true adorers will be honored in the Holy Spirit and in the Son, who is the way and the truth. Dinah replied, I know that the Messiah cometh. When he is come, he will tell us all things. In these words here, at the well of Jacob, spoke that portion of the Samaritan sect which might lay some legitimate claim to the promise. I hope for, I believe in the coming of the Messiah. He will help us. Jesus responded, I am he. I who now speak to thee. By this he said to all Samaria that would be converted, Samaria, I came to Jacob's well athirst for thee, thou water of this well, and when thou givest me to drink, I promise thee living water that would never let thee thirst again. And thou didst, hoping and believing, make known to me thy longing for this water. Behold, I reward thee, for thou hast allayed my thirst after thee by thy desire after me. Samaria, I am the fountain of living water. I who now speak to thee am the Messiah. As Jesus pronounced the words, I am the Messiah, Dinah, trembling with holy joy, gazed at him in amazement. But suddenly recovering herself, she turned, and leaving her water bottle standing in the well open, she fled down the hill to Shechem to tell her husband and all whom she met what had happened to her. It was strictly forbidden to leave the well of Jacob open, but what cared Dinah now for the well of Jacob? What cared she for her bucket of earthly water? She had received the living water, and her loving, joyous heart was longing to pour its refreshing streams over all her neighbors. But as she was hurrying out of the spring house, she ran past the 3 disciples who had come with the food and had already been standing for some time at a little distance from the door, wondering what their master could have had to say for so long with a Samaritan woman. But through reverence for him, they forbore the question. Dinah ran down the Shechem and with great eagerness said to her husband and others whom she met on the street, "Come up to Jacob's well. There you will see a man that has told me all the secret actions of my life. Come, he is certainly the Christ." Meanwhile, the 3 disciples approached Jesus, who was still by the well, and offering some rolls and honey out of their basket, saying, "Master, eat." Jesus arose and left the well with the words, "I have meat to eat which you do not know." The disciples said to one another, "Hath any man brought him to eat?" And they thought to themselves, "Did the Samaritan woman give him to eat?" Jesus would not stop to eat, but began descending the hill to Shechem. The disciples followed, eating. Jesus said to them as he went on before, "My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, that I may perfect his work." By that he meant to convert the people of Shechem, after whose salvation his soul hungered. He spoke much more to the same purport. When near the city, Dinah the Samaritan again appeared hurrying back to meet Jesus. She joined him respectfully, but full of joy and frankness, and Jesus addressed many words to her, sometimes standing still and sometimes moving slowly forward. He unfolded to her all her past life with all the dispositions of her soul. She was deeply moved and promised that both she and her husband would abandon all and follow him. He pointed out to her many ways by which she could do penance for her sins and repair her scandals. Dinah was an intelligent woman of some standing in the world, the offspring of a mixed marriage, a Jewish mother and a pagan father, born upon a country seat near Damascus. She had lost her parents at an early age and had been cared for by a dissolute nurse by whom her evil passions had been fostered. She had had 5 husbands, one after another. Some had died of grief, others had been put out of the way by her new lovers. She had 3 daughters and 2 half-grown sons, all of whom had remained with the relatives of their respective fathers when their mother was obliged to leave Damascus. Dinah's sons at a later period joined the 72 disciples. The man with whom she was now living was a relative of one of her former husbands. He was a rich merchant. As Dinah followed the Samaritan religion, she had induced the man to remove to Shechem, where she superintended his household and lived with him, though without being espoused to him. They were looked upon in Shechem as a married couple. The husband was a vigorous man of about 36 years with a ruddy face and a reddish beard. There were many things in Dinah's life similar to those of Magdalene's, but she had fallen more deeply than the latter. Still, I once saw that in the beginning of Magdalene's evil career at Magdalene, one of her lovers lost his life at the hand of a rival. Dinah was an uncommonly gifted, open-hearted, easily influenced, pleasing woman of great vivacity and impetuosity. But she was always disturbed in conscience. She was living now more respectably, that is, with her reputed husband, in a house that stood alone and surrounded by a moat near the gate leading from Shechem to the spring house. Though not held in contempt by the inhabitants, still they did not leave or have much communication with her. Her manners were different from theirs, her costume elaborate and studied, all which, however, they pardoned in her, as she was a stranger. While Jesus was speaking with Dinah, the disciples followed at some distance, wondering what he could have to say to the woman. "We have brought him food, and that with a good deal of difficulty. Why now does he not eat?" When near Shechem, Dinah left the Lord and hurried forward to meet her husband and many of the citizens who came pouring out of their houses, all curiosity to see Jesus. Full of joy, they exulted and shouted salutations of welcome to him. Jesus, standing still, motioned with his hand for silence and addressed them kindly for some moments, telling them, among other things, to believe all that the woman had told them. Jesus was so remarkably gracious in his words, his glance was so bright and penetrating that all the hearts beat more quickly. All were borne toward him, and they were pressing in their solicitations for him to enter and teach in their city. He promised that he would do so, but for the present passed on. This scene took place somewhere between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. While Jesus was thus addressing the Samaritans outside the gate, all the other disciples, among them Peter, who in the morning had gone on commissions in a different direction, returned to their master. They were surprised, and not any too well pleased to see him talking so long with the Samaritans. They felt somewhat embarrassed at it, for they'd been reared in this preconceived idea that they were to have no communication with these people. Consequently, they had never before seen anything like this. They felt tempted to take scandal at it. They reflected upon the hardships of yesterday and the day before, on all the scorn and insult, on the cruel treatment that they had endured. They had expected an easier time, since the women of Bethany had advanced so much money for that end. Seeing now this business with the Samaritans, they thought to themselves, it was certainly no wonder when things went on in this way that they were not better received. Their heads were always full of extravagant worldly fancies of the kingdom that Jesus was to establish, and they thought, if all this should become known in Galilee, they would indeed be derided. Peter had in Samaria a long conversation with that young man who wanted to join the disciples but was still wavering. He afterwards spoke with Jesus on the subject. Jesus went with them all about a half hour around the city to the north, and there rested under some trees. On the way thither, the Lord had been conversing with them about the harvest, a subject which he now continued. He said, "There is a proverb often on the lips, yet 4 months, and the harvest cometh." Sluggards are ever desirous of putting off their work, but they should look around and see all of the fields standing white for the harvest. Jesus meant the Samaritans and others who were ripe for conversion. Ye disciples are called to the harvest, though ye have not sown. Others have sown, namely the prophets and John and I myself. He that reapeth receiveth wages and gathereth fruit for eternal life, that both he that soweth and he that reapeth may rejoice together. For in this is the saying true, that it is one man that soweth, and it is another that reapeth. I have sent you to reap that in which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labors. In this way, Jesus spoke to the disciples in order to encourage them to work. They rested only a short time and then separated, Andrew, Philip, Saturnin, and John remaining with Jesus, while the others went on to Galilee, passing between Thebes and Samaria. Jesus, leaving Shechem to the right, journeyed about an hour southward to a field around which were scattered 20 shepherd huts and tents. In one of the larger huts, the Blessed Virgin and Mary Cleophas, the wife of James the Greater, And the two of the widows were awaiting him. They had been there the whole day, having brought with them food and little flasks of balsam. They now prepared a meal. On meeting his mother, Jesus extended both hands to her, while she inclined her head to him. The women saluted him by bowing their head and crossing their hands on their breasts. There was a tree in front of the house, and under it they took the meal. Among the shepherds dwelling around these parts were the parents of the youths whom Jesus, after the raising of Lazarus, took with him on his journey to Arabia and to Egypt. These people had come to Bethlehem in the suite of the three holy kings, had on account of their hasty departure of the latter remained behind in this country, and had married some of the shepherds' daughters in the valley near Bethlehem. Shepherd settlements like that just mentioned were frequent in the winding valleys between this place and Bethlehem. The people dwelling here cultivated also in the field of Joseph's inheritance, which they had rented from the Shechemites. There were many of them gathered here, but no Samaritans. The first noteworthy incident that took place here was the Blessed Virgin's begging Jesus to cure a lame boy whom some of the neighboring shepherds had brought thither. They had before doing so implored Mary's intercession. Such things happened very often, and it was quite affecting to see her asking Jesus for these favors. Jesus commanded that the boy should be brought, and the parents bore him on a little litter to the door of the house in which Jesus was. The child was about 9 years old. Jesus addressed some words of exhortation to the parents, and as they fell back, somewhat timidly awaiting the result, the disciples gathered around Jesus. He spoke to the boy, leaned a little over him, and took him by the hand and raised him up. The boy jumped out of the litter, took a few steps, and then ran into the arms of his parents, who cast themselves with him at Jesus' feet. The crowd uttered cries of joy, but Jesus reminded them to thank the Heavenly Father. He then addressed a short instruction to the assembled shepherds and took with the disciples a light repast, which the women had prepared in an ardor under the great tree in front of the house. Mary and the women sat apart at the end of the table. I am under the impression that this house was taken for one of the private inns, and was prepared and served by the holy women of Capernaum. There approached now, and that rather timidly, several persons from Shechem, among them Dinah, the woman of the well. They did not venture to draw near, because they were not accustomed to have dealings with the Jewish shepherds. Dinah, however, made bold to advance first, and I saw her talking with the women and the Blessed Virgin. After the repast, Jesus and his disciples took leave of the holy women, who immediately set about preparing for the return journey to Galilee. Thither Jesus himself was to go the next day but one. Jesus now returned with Dinah and the other Samaritans to Shechem, a city not very large, but with broad streets and open squares. The Samaritan house of prayer was a finer-looking building, more ornamented than the synagogues of small Jewish places. The women of Shechem were not so reserved as the Jewish women. They communicated more freely with the men. As soon as Jesus entered Shechem, he was surrounded by a crowd. He did not go into their synagogue, but taught, walking around here and there on the streets, and in one of the squares where there was an orator's chair. Everywhere was the concourse of people very great. They were full of joy at the Messiah's having come to them. Dinah, though very much moved and very recollected, was of all the women the one that approached nearest to Jesus. Her neighbors now looked upon her with special regard, as she had been the first to find Jesus. She sent the man with whom she was living to Jesus, who spoke to him a few words of the exhortation. He stood before Jesus quite embarrassed and ashamed of his sins. Jesus did not tarry long in Shechem, but went out by the opposite gate and taught here and there among the houses and gardens that extended for some distance along the valley. He put up in an inn distant from Shechem a good half hour, promising, however, to return to the city on the following day and to give them an instruction. So finally, we are Thursday, July 27th. When Jesus went again to Shechem, he taught the whole day, dividing the time between the orator's chair in the city and the hills outside, and in the evening he taught again in the inn. From the whole country around came crowds to hear him, and they followed him from place to place. The cry was, "Now he is teaching here! Now he is teaching there!" The young man of Samaria also listened to the instructions, but he did not speak with Jesus. Dinah was everywhere foremost, everywhere made her way through the crowd to Jesus. She was very attentive, very earnest, and deeply impressed. She had had another interview with Jesus and was now about to separate from her reputed husband. They had resolved, for Jesus' sake, to consecrate all their riches to the poor and the good of the future church. Jesus told them how to proceed in the affair. Many of the Samaritans were profoundly touched by what they had seen and heard. They said to Dinah, "Thou hast spoken truly. We have now heard him ourselves. He is the Messiah." The good woman was quite out of herself, and so in earnest, so joyous. I have always loved her dearly. Here, as in former places, Jesus took for the subjects of his discourse the imprisonment of John, the persecution of the prophets, the precursor charged to prepare the ways, the son sent to the vineyard, but who was murdered by the wicked servants. He declared plainly that the Father had sent him. He taught also upon all that he had said to the woman at the well, namely, the living water, Mount Gerizim, salvation from the Jews, the nearness of the kingdom, and the judgment, and the punishment inflicted upon the wicked servants who had put to death the son of their Lord of the vineyard. Many of his hearers questioned him as to where they should now be baptized and cleansed, since John was imprisoned. Jesus answered that John's disciples were again baptizing near Aenon, across the Jordan, and that until he himself should appear there with his disciples to give baptism, they should go thither. On the following day, accordingly, crowds flocked to Aenon. Next day, Jesus taught at the inn and on surrounding hills. His audience consisted of laborers, of all kinds of people, and those slaves whom, after his baptism, he had once consoled in the field of the shepherds near Bethabara. There were present also many spies sent by the Pharisees from the environs around. They listened to him with anger in their hearts, struck their hands together, and muttered jeeringly. But they did not attempt to accost him, and he took no notice of them. Several Samaritan doctors and others remained unmoved by his words, receiving them into a disaffected heart. And here is finally where I end the reading. As I said before, in the reading before, that this subtext was really long, so apologize. But it is a depth reading, so now I get into my notes. All right, so I had a pretty deep connection with John 4. I love the Gospel of John. I read it a lot in my life. I studied it a lot. And I'm a student of literature, so I love reading between the lines. You know, you dig into the ocean. You want to find what's on the ocean floor, not just read the surface of it. Anyways, so I discovered, and I had this discussion with some people. They're always looking like, oh, well, it can't be inconsistent. But one of the discrepancies of the gospel is the time of the crucifixion. And some of them, he was put onto the cross at Golgotha at 9 a.m. and died at 3 p.m. He hung on the cross for 6 hours. But in the Gospel of John, he was sentenced at about noon. Now, this is not to say one of them is true and the other is false. No, we don't look at it like that. Remember, I said this about discrepancies between this text and Mystical City, and you might even have studied Maria Valtorta's work. And there are discrepancies there too, but we don't look at it like that. We want to read the signification of each telling of it so that we understand what the author is truly trying to convey. If you're sitting here questioning whether this is true or false, you're doing the wrong thing with this text. Now, in John 4, we read in the gospel that Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at about noon. Oh, it's the same wording, right? Now, she says here it's midday, so she's correct. It does perfectly reference John 4, which, yes, we should read it as midday, like actual midday. But John doesn't put these things in for no reason. Now, he was to say, yes, Jesus was tired and weary from the journey. Yes, that makes sense. Because I had suggested to me that, well, the 6th hour means the 6th hour after midnight. No, actually, it means 6th hour after 6 a.m., which is when the Jews started their daylight day, right? The Jewish day calendar budged forward at 6 p.m. in the evening. So they had 12 hours of night and then 12 hours of day. So anyways, John's a very in-depth author. I said that. So every last detail in this gospel is to be read like he put it in there for a very specific purpose. The sun being at the apex of the sky at this point tells us that Jesus is now addressing this town like God has come here. They have that perplexing questions put before them. Will they or won't they accept the Messiah? Because at the crucifixion, when Jesus was sentenced, it was using the same words at about noon. Pilate told the people, here is your king. And now Jerusalem had to make a choice at that time, right? Because the sun was now at its apex in the sky. Now, the question is, accept the Messiah or deny him? Regretfully, Jerusalem chose poorly, but Samaria, however, did not. Dinah was the placeholder of Samaria, as we learn in the text. Now, when posed with the question, Samaria admitted, he is the Messiah. That is the ones who were ripe for the picking, so to speak. And they chose wisely. So when she suggested that the Samaritan woman represented all of Samaria, I understood it right away because I always figured it to be the interpretation from the Gospel of John. I remember I visited a friend in London, and she took me to a non-denominational service. Can't call it a mass because it's not. Ironically, the Samaritans of our times, the non-denominationals, and the Protestants and whatnot. And they read John 4, or the first part of it. This is John 4, but it doesn't include the royal official story near the end, so it's most of it, like 2/3 of it. Anyway, the problem with these people, that is the non-denominationals, is that they can only read, many of them, the text as literally as possible. It's incompleteness. It lacks the fullness. If they had the fullness of the reading, they would convert to the church. It's just ipso facto. Which, and for them, it's like looking at the surface of the ocean and pretending to know what's at the base of it just by looking at the surface of it. You cannot read the Gospel of John like this from its most literal sense and even get a tenth of what it's trying to relay, because John was a very intelligent and spiritually advanced man. So his work is a literary work. This is why he was so close to our Queen and Our Lady, because he was the one most worthy of receiving wisdom. That requires, now this work requires deep delves so that you can find its treasures on the ocean's floor, so to speak. And I recently had a dream about that, where I was going to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean to find treasures on the ocean floor. I somehow was able to withstand the immense pressure, the immense coldness, and the immense depth, but that's what I do, I guess. So saying that Christ was warning her against adultery, and that's what they were saying, and I was saying to my friend, no, it's much more than that. He's warning all Samaria against getting sea washed. Now, if you've watched my videos routinely, you know I mention this motif time and time again. Sea washed is when the nations come in and influence a region and it tears them away from Christ, right? It tears them away from God. So to speak, Samaria is part of Israel that got flooded with that dead water, that sea water, paganism and idolatry that causes its good water, its verdant water, to become sullied and renders the perfect worship of Jerusalem sullied into an imperfect worship, something that's mitigated, eclipsed. And so they get less fecundity from that water, and their souls are left longing for more because it is not giving them the true living water. So what is the true living water? In nature, it is the water filled with minerals flowing down the mountains, drunk up by nature because it is fertile. It grows the trees. It gives them fruit. And if you've ever grown like an apple tree or an orange tree, you know that you need to fertilize the ground in order for that tree to yield fruit. And so, dig in them rusty nails or whatever. So it makes very much green territory, right? So, yet because Samaria cut themselves off from Jerusalem and opened themselves up to the pagans and the traders, that is the merchants, and this was done when the schism happened between Judea and Israel after the reign of Solomon was ended, they became sea-washed, so to speak. So I remember I was watching a Protestant, and this was before I'd come back into the fullness of the Catholic faith. Now, for those that don't know, I had been routinely attending Mass until I was about 18, and then I stopped for about 15 years, regrettably. I was still having dreams and whatnot, but I'd stopped because the Catholic faith wasn't reaching me anymore. It was just, I was becoming disconnected from everything. So in that period, I still was reading the Bible and studying and everything. I had effectively become like this Samaritan, like this Protestant. I was listening to Protestants. One of them I was listening to was Chuck Missler. He was trying to interpret Revelation 17, and he was onto something, but as usual with the Protestants, he was incomplete. Now, I had bought into the whole Bible is a magic book kind of thing, so, I was trying to read it. My problem is I was reading it with more fullness, and I came back to Catholicism because of the fullness with which I was getting from the text. Now remember that Revelation 17 was also written by John. I call John 4 week 1. John 4, week 1, day 4, because it's the first week of his text. He has 50 chapters if you combine all of his writings in the New Testament. So Revelation 17 would technically be week 7, day 3, or the 5th chapter of the last decade if you split them in the 5/10s. Now, if you watch my Sirocco video, you'll remember that I look at all of John's New Testament writings as a set of 50, like I just said, like a jubilee. He said that Israel has been conquered 5 times, that it's in Revelation 17, and that the Romans were the 6th and would remain a short time. And I'm talking Chuck Missler said this. And then some mysterious entity called Rome 2 would take them over. And he's sort of combining his analysis of Revelation 17 with Daniel, the statues, I think, where Rome 2 would have been the part of the statue that was clay mixed with iron. So, as I said before, it was an incomplete interpretation because it was missing the fullness of the faith. We try to interpret these things, but if we don't use heaven's further revelation from seers and whatnot, we're not going to get a full story. And this text, Catherine Ann Emmerich, is a seer, which helps us bring the fullness of the interpretation. right? That's just why we have seers, because we can't think that we can read the Bible and expect to understand it fully. Even all of mankind's efforts put together could not do this. We require angelic revelation to do it because it's missing the keys to open up what's in there, what's locked in there. And there's a lot that's locked in, not just in the Bible, but in the prophecies the seers, the later seers would bring us. So this text, Revelation 17, is meant to be read from several different realms with a catalog of references only to show how evil operates. That is, Revelation was written to outline what the devil's doing and how he's going to try to take down the true faith. So it's meant to exact the failures of the Jews using their old example, that is, when they were between David and the first fall of the temple and the rebuilding of the second temple, and when they crucified Christ and when it was brought down by the Romans. These express that the Jews, they have a rise in understanding and then the fall in understanding. And if you don't really look into the Old Testament and realize that the Jews live in these cycles of their own destruction, we don't really get this text. So this text references the number 7, like the 7 waves of the beast. And this 6th part is where they were at. They had failed to recognize the Messiah, so they had entered into the fullness of darkness, and they would now be cleansed. The cleansing took place when the second temple was destroyed and when Jerusalem was flattened by Titus's siege, right? And the text is literally referring to that, but it's also figuratively referring to how the Jews continue to fail again and again because they do not accept the Messiah. They do not accept the living water. So, the 6th part of their cycle is always living in oppressive times, either as the holy few or the evil many. Like a reference to Genesis 6, where most of the world had gone bad. Now Jesus says to Dinah, the Samaritan, "You have had 5 husbands," i.e., you are in your 6th hour. Right? And what was the day? Wait. What was the day at? Oh yeah, 6th hour. Okay? This all blends together. So he's talking about all the conquests they've endured, the false husbands, the idols. Samaria has to confess, admit its fault, and it did in the text. The man confessed. Who's the man? Man represented Rome. This woman was the child of a pagan and a Jew. Again, rich in symbolism. She was prophetically meant to meet Christ at this time. Samaria has to admit its fault, that it had fallen into schism, and that they had now to declare that they were in the wrong the whole time. So, they had been conquered by, zum Beispiel, for example, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and now they're with the Romans. And these nations represent the proverbial sea, the water that is barren. Much of what is said in this chapter can be related to the Eastern Orthodox and to the Anglicans and the other Protestants. The Vatican is the great tree that produced many fruits. Not lately, but, we still have Blessed Carlo Acutis. And there's that girl, I wish I remembered her name, the one that refused to take painkillers when she was dying of cancer because she wanted to offer up her suffering for the Lord. I wish I remembered her name. She's worthy. But the East Orthodox, they produce some saints. I mean, when you look at the Greek monasteries in their islands, they still have very holy life there. And the others produce pretty much none. You don't see many Protestant saints or anything like that. A lot of them, because they kind of cap their progress. They think, oh, well, they get into a habitual life, but they don't live in constant pursuit of perfection. They kind of get comfortable. And this is the problem. That's what causes people never to yield fruit, is they constantly seek comfort. They live under the shade of a big tree, and they don't live in the sunlight and in the rain. They don't live oscillating between rest and war. You have to fight. You have to fight. You have to fight against the devils. The more you fight against the devils, the more it produces fruit in you. The saints are the fruits of the church. They spring branches, they spring leaves, but where are the fruits? They're not fighting the devils. And you'll know as a Catholic, you're fighting against the devils. So what I did not know that this text said is that Jesus said, give me water to drink. God wanted their souls to adore him. I think I forgot this because, or I didn't detect this because we often forget how precious we are to God. And I very routinely forget that. Now, another thing we can absorb from this rich reading, and I know this reading has gone on way long, but is how the Marian apparitions work. Marian seers, we must know, are chosen for the same reason that Jesus chose Dinah to prophetically speak for the Samaritans. When you start connecting the dots, the ideas will flourish in your minds surely. She often appears to girls because women are like representatives of the land, daughters of the church, symbolic of the nations they live in. Now, since nations are not perfectly exemplified by a single region, the region tends to be more represented than the nation is. So Our Lady appeared to, and this is a good example, she appeared to Ukraine. Ukraine was actually the first country that consecrated herself to Russia, or to Russia, to the Immaculate Heart of the Virgin, sorry. Oops. For example, she did not appear to that part being taken by the Russians now, the east, but to Kiev, I think Khrushchev, and to a place in their west called Seredny, which I think means the middle, because Ukraine is a lot more Catholic in its western region. The country is being tilled right now. That is, it's unfortunately going through the gruesome tilling blades of war. And it may be that Russia converts to Catholicism, like the statue that falls upon this stone and crumbles the statue. But I don't know. There's two conflicting views here. Because if you read Aloy Erlmeyer's prophecy, you know that Russia sweeps right through Europe, all the way to possibly Brittany, but we don't know. But I suppose we shall wait and see. Maybe Russia never takes this Catholic region. Kiev is sort of in the middle, but anyways. That's it. Ave Maria.